Greetings everyone, I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. We're continuing our trek through the John Adams miniseries, and here we are with episode 2 out of 7, Independence, which is a perfect name for this episode, considering that this episode covers a period from the First Continental Congress to the colonies deciding that this is no longer just a rebellion of self-defense, it is a rebellion for independency. And of course, with the reading of the Declaration of Independence at the very end. And it is also the longest of all the episodes, because most of the episodes clock in about an hour, a little bit over. This one clocks in at about 90 minutes. So it's like a very short film. And considering the subject matter and the amount of time that it has to do, just about a year from July 1775 to July 1776, you need that time. Probably could have made it a bit longer to cover more direct stuff, but it might have affected the pacing there. And considering that we see everything from John Adams' POV, it makes sense it's only 90, because we're seeing all the big points. The historical events it covers is the Olive Branch Petition. Those of you who don't know history, that's what the First Continental Congress sent to George III after the battles of Lexington and Concord. Is like, hey, Your Majesty, I know we just had a fight and all, but can we just stop and I'll be civil Englishmen for a second? Which, of course, in the context of the episode, John Adams is all like, blah, 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 blah. Like when I believe it's John Dickinson is reading aloud what it's going to be, they're all making comments, but no one will read. Which even Sam Adams joins in on them. So that's a little interesting to see that in the first episode, the Adams boys were not quite on the same page until the end when they decide, hey, we got to go to Congress. But here they're on the same page throughout. Nice little bit of compare and contrast between episode 1 and episode 2. Shows the aftermath of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Since Adams wasn't there, we don't see the battle directly. We just see the aftermath and feel the aftermath, all the way down to George III's State of Rebellion letter, which was his response to the Olive Branch Petition. Which, I just love that scene where they read it in Congress, where you could see the look on everyone's face, their reaction to it. And I believe it's summed up best in 2 moments in that scene. Sam Adams' response of God save the king, turning it into God damn the king. And then Ben Franklin going, God bless the king. Who else could bring a spirit of unity to this Congress? Which has a good point there. And as I said before, it ends with the Declaration of Independence. A lot of the good drama comes from the transitions from the aftermath of the State of Rebellion letter to them deciding to declare independence. If you've ever seen the play or the movie version of 1776, it's some of that same drama, but it's not as stylized as that since that's a musical. But that same type of drama is there. And it's very, very interesting to see it unfold. Especially since at the beginning only about a few people are talking about really wanting to fight, wanting to declare independence, and Adams even sums it up best as like, nobody speaks of it. But as time goes on, within that year, you're like, okay, they're getting more and more open, more and more stuff happens, more and more soldiers are dying. The British are sending more and more people. George III's getting a little bit more choke happy with everything. The blockade of Boston and all. You could see why they decided to declare independence within the context of the show. Because obviously, in real life history, there was a lot of complexities that we're not seeing here, but it makes sense because this show is about John Adams and the history that unfolded around him and the impact he had on history. So most of the stuff we're going to see is from his perspective. It's like him, and whenever we cut back to Abigail, they're the point of view characters. If this was a novel, there would be the POV characters, like in Game of Thrones. We had Sansa and all them being point of view characters, and we see the events through their point of view and get their little commentary so that we have their perspective. Here it's kind of like that, only since it's a visual medium and not prose, we don't have the whole thing of having their inner monologue. We just watching it through their perspective and getting it through how they're talking in certain scenes. Not that that's a bad thing, but we don't have that additional thing with the POV. Outside the Adams boys and minor characters that drift in and out of the plot, we're introduced to 3 important historical characters in this episode. John Dickinson, who's played by, I'm probably going to butcher this name, Zeliko Avenk, who was also an Argo in Seven Psychopaths. He does a pretty good job as John Dickinson. He's not as theatrical as how the character is presented in the musical, but from what I know about him in real life, this is closer to how he was. He's Quaker, so he has some of those sensibilities. The end shows that he joined the military after leaving the Congress, which is true. One thing that is not mentioned at all is the fact that Dickinson had a hand in writing the Articles of Confederation. For those of you who don't remember or did not pay attention in history class, the Articles of Confederation was the document that helped run the country that predated the Constitution. However, there was a lot of problems with it, and that's a simplification because we could not really run the country on it because it gave too much power to the states and not enough to the federal government. I mean, even nowadays, people talk about how the states should have a little bit more leeway in certain things and the federal government should get a little bit more hands-off. You got to have the right balance, I think, there. Because here, with the Articles, it's like you gave too much to the states where they could just ignore stuff from the federal, like, hey, we're the federal government, you got to behave. Okay. Hey, stop that. Why? Because we're the feds, we said so. So? It's like, oh, how's it doing? What are you going to do? Come on. What are you going to do? They had to get rid of it. We got the Constitution. Things, for the most part, run a lot more smoothly. Now, the reason that they did not even mention it, I think, is that thing I just said about POV, is that there's never a moment where it could come up naturally. Just like they never mentioned directly about Dickinson joining the military. It's just implied through the visuals at the end, but that's enough because we see there's like, all right, he's going to get behind it. He doesn't have enough right here to vote for it. Which, needing something like the Articles is part of the reason that he didn't vote for it, if I remember correctly. But he believes in it enough that he's going to join the military. Even the musical, with how they changed Dickinson's real-life character into a more typical conservative Tory for the majority of that one, they still ended with him deciding to not vote yay and derail it and decide to join the military. Lead to a nice little moment where everyone's like, to see him out of the Congress chamber. The second character, of course, is Benjamin Franklin, played beautifully by Tom Wilkinson. Wilkinson, you know, Dark Knight amongst other films. When I first saw this miniseries, I'm like, that's an interesting choice. Let's see how he does. And first time I watch it now, he played Benjamin Franklin perfectly. Now, you get that little sage quality that seems to have built up around Franklin since he passed away in the years. But you also seem to get a sense that he's a flesh and blood character, gray, which continues over the course of the next couple episodes, if memory serves me correctly. And he does a pretty good job. Now, the thing is, the whole thing about him wearing glasses, we only really see it in the scene where him and Adams are reading over Jefferson's initial draft of the Declaration of Independence, which, that reminds me, should be 4 characters, because Jefferson's also in there. He only comes up as a major character in the latter half of the episode, though. But Franklin's there throughout. You really do get the sense of his humor, the fact he wants independency, but he's not going to voice it until it comes up. And he has a couple of the best lines in the whole episode, and they're pretty good ones. This is what he says. I believe everyone not in favor of moderation and compromise ought to be castrated. You know, going a little extreme with the dark humor, but it's the thing there is, like, with politics, compromise is the name of the game, for better and for worse. And if you're not in favor of it or going in moderation in certain regards, then yeah, you are playing more just to get power rather than try to accomplish something. Politics is the art of the possible. Another good one. And this next one is a pretty good point. Thinking aloud is responsible for most of mankind's misery. That one he says to John Adams in response to John talking a little too obnoxiously during one meeting of Congress and insulting John Adams. And as he tells him, if you insult someone in private, they'll probably thank you for it. But you insult someone in public, they tend to believe you're serious. So thinking aloud, yeah, probably not the best thing. Which this whole little character arc of Ben being Adams' political mentor, you really do see it change. Because in the first half, he's being very insulting to characters. Like I said, he insults John Dickinson. Then at the end, when they're giving the speech about which way to vote for it, you can tell that while he is still being passionate and he's still delivering things with a fiery oratory, he is being a little bit more restrained when it comes to directly insulting people. So a nice little change of pace, and another reason why Giamatti, deserved that Emmy that he won there. Since I just brought him up, we have Stephen Delane, the future Stannis Baratheon, as Thomas Jefferson, which he does a pretty good job. I mean, we see a little bit more from him from the next couple episodes, so he has time to build it. I mean, he doesn't stand out as well as Wilkinson and the others so far. Obviously, he's in more episodes than the character Sam Adams is, so he has a little bit of a longer impact on the whole show. Here, you can tell he's soft-spoken. You really only notice that that's who it is when he's addressed by name. You're like, oh, so that's supposed to be Thomas Jefferson. Very soft-spoken. Doesn't really say a lot. And I love the scene where him and John are talking, and John realizes this guy, even though he doesn't say a lot, doesn't mean he's not thinking, doesn't mean he could say stuff. He just has to have it. Which I identify with. I mean, there are instances where I can't really think of something good to say, but I could put it to paper and make it sound pretty well. And also, some people seem to be surprised that just because I don't say anything doesn't mean I'm not thinking about something. Which, of course, depending on the context, could be good for my occupation or bad. But in certain instances where it's like, okay, making a note of that person, it can be good. With this one, it's like the shock and all that really does lead into it. And, of course, because he knows he can write well, that's part of the reason why Adams, in the context of the show, is like, all right, Mr. Jefferson, you're going to have to write it. They don't go over the top like in the musical. You know, if I'm the one to do it, they'll run their quill pins through it. He really does believe in him, and he does get him. I mean, they do make some edits to the declaration before they submit it, but they're like semantical ones. They're like, yeah, we might want to change the wording there just a bit. Still have the same point, same thing you want. We just got to change it to make sure that everybody is fine with the wording, since we're going to all be signing off on this. And the last one, of course, is David Morse as the then Colonel, soon to be General, George Washington. And he plays him with such conviction that you look at him and you're like, that's not an actor, that is the future President George Washington. And he plays him so humbly, with dignity. And he also has some of the other good lines in the episode. If the Congress sees fit to offer me a command, it will be my humble duty to serve. That right there sums up George in a nutshell. I know there's other complexities, the whole slavery issue, which is an interesting scene where he's talking with Abigail about it, and he doesn't even give his opinion on it. You can tell he's probably thinking about it, but he decides not to talk about it. Which I know some people are going to jump right on and go, oh, he was a slave owner and all that. It's like, some of these men had some complexities when it comes to that. I mean, we all know Thomas Jefferson actually wanted to get rid of the institution of slavery despite the fact he owned slaves. He just never was in the financial position to do so, which I know some people are going to go, oh, we should have still released them. It's like, not in the financial position to do so. I know, as much as I hate saying that sentence, it's like, with that one, we're comparing our sensibilities now to the sensibilities then. Now, there are certain regards involving slavery, there is something you can do with that, such as having power in certain light over somebody, but that's a specific situation and not talking about the economics of it. I mean, the whole economics of it technically is what leads into the Civil War, but that's a discussion for another time. Getting back on point about Morse's Washington, he does play him with a humble dignity. He is soft-spoken. I'd say about the same as Jefferson, but whereas Jefferson does not really speak his mind, Washington, he'll speak his mind, but he always speaks it with soft-spokenness, to where you could tell that he wants to get his point across, but he does not want to insult people directly. So, of course, even though he was mainly in the military field, he did learn that whole lesson that Ben Franklin was trying to teach Adams. And this is another line that ties in with that. I do not think myself equal to the command I'm honored with. Very soft-spoken, very humble, but he can do the job. And, of course, there's a joke line that Ben Franklin says about him. I mean, he's the tallest person in the room. He's bound to be leading something. That's more of a little joke about it, but it's just that Washington commands so much respect that you understand why his men follow him. And I don't believe it's in the show, because Adams obviously wasn't around it, but that makes me think of one moment in history where he actually got the men to side with him later on, where he's trying to read something and then he has to put his glasses on. He's like, forgive me, men. I've grown blind in the service of my country. That's probably not the direct quote, but that encapsulated, where he commanded so much respect from just such a simple action that men forgot whatever their grievances was and were like, go general. And Giamatti and Morse have this little bit of a soft chemistry with one another. From the first time they're talking, you could tell that they're working well together. Probably from all the practice that they had to do before going in front of the camera. But from the but these two characters, you can tell they gel in a certain way, which is going to become interesting once we get to the episodes involving the first presidency and then Adams becoming president. Especially the little tea scene that'll happen in that episode. We'll see how that relationship develops. Now, slavery, I mentioned, is brought up a couple times. I mean, Abigail's anti-slavery, which she mentioned in the first episode. She mentions it a couple times in this episode. They do bring it up in the context of the Declaration, but it's only in passing in one scene, and they don't build it up in the scenes involving the Congress. And that's encapsulated perfectly in a line that Ben Franklin says, that it's independence, not emancipation, that is their goal right now. Which, of course, I'm surprised they didn't have Adams say a line that is attributed to him that most people don't usually include because it sounds too much hindsight. That's why they didn't include it in 1776, and that was him telling Franklin, if we give up on this issue, there will be a war 100 years hence. Sounds too much like hindsight, which is probably why they didn't include it, but it would have been interesting to like have him start it and then Franklin go, and go on to his next little point. It's nice that it's addressed, and I could see why, since I decided to address it quickly, why they didn't bring it up in any of the big Congress scenes. But also, they probably didn't want to make it seem more like 1776 revisited and having a whole big scene at the end with it. Especially when there are other intricacies involving the politics of getting the people to vote yes. Which is probably perfectly summarized in the scene where South Carolina's representative meets semi-clandestinely with John Adams to talk about it. Like, yeah, we're for independence. We just want to make sure that we can win, all that. Which eventually does lead to them eventually getting it, but they have to get Pennsylvania, which they have to get Dickinson out, so a lot of backroom meetings, clandestine. One thing I never noticed the first time I watched this episode is the fact that we never see the North Carolina delegate. Whenever they're talking about the Carolinas, it's always South Carolina. I'm guessing because they couldn't figure out how to incorporate the character in. The only time we ever hear them is a scene in the vote where they ask North Carolina's vote, and you hear it. And it's very noticeable when you hear it, and you know this little piece of info, is that the vocal quality is different than every other voice, and that's because it was added later. You can definitely tell it was recorded in a room and not recorded live on the set. And they didn't even try to match the vocal quality, so from a technical standpoint, it's a nitpick, but it's noticeable. As I've mentioned a couple times before, this episode does end with the Declaration of Independence, but with it, it has the perfect ending where we see a good amount of members of the Congress standing outside a building while it's read to the people. We see the local militia unit being commanded by Dickinson standing by, holding up the flag. Dickinson on his horse as the officer in charge. Dignity about him, leading as someone's reading it. Cuts back to Abigail and the children reading it over, having, I think her name was Abby as well, their daughter read it. You know, get stuck on the word inalienable and go through it. They go through the first part of it, and I think they stop right about the first charge levied against the king, but it's a nice way. It's not too overtly political and patriotic, but it's not under. It's like the right balance. Like if you're super patriotic, it'd make you go like, yeah, America. If you're like patriotic but not a lot, it's like, all right, they're not like shoving it in your face. It works for the context of the scene in both the miniseries and from real life history. Of course, I don't know off the top of my head if they actually stood outside and did something like that in real life when they announced it, but for the visual medium, it works. And like I said at the top of this part, is the perfect way to end this episode and segue into the next episode, which next one is really going to be about work and politics, because in this episode, it's about the colonies slowly moving towards declaring independence, whereas the next episode is going to deal more with some of the back politics of fighting the Revolutionary War, more specifically dragging France into the conflict. We're going to get more adventures of Franklin and Adams. But overseas, vive la France. Thanks for watching.